go ahead and turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 17 as we begin this new series. Now, John the Baptist was not your typical religious leader. He didn't walk around in long, flowing ecclesiastical robes. Instead, he wore a garment made of camel's hair, which was rough, probably itchy. He lived in the wilderness, so his face would have been weathered and tanned. His hair was long, undoubtedly uncombed, more than likely matted. We're told that John the Baptist ate a diet of locust and honey. And so I'm guessing old John was a bachelor. The Old Testament equivalent to John the Baptist is the prophet Elijah. And apparently they shared the same tailor. So in 2 Kings 1 and verse 7, the king asked them, "What kind of man was it who came to meet you and who told you this?" And they replied, "He was a man with a garment of hair and with a leather belt around his waist." And the king said, "That was Elijah the Tishbite." Tishbite being translated incredibly tacky dresser. And then in Matthew, we see John the Baptist described almost the same way. John's clothes were made of camel's hair, and he had a leather belt around his waist. His food was locust and wild honey. Now, all you have to do is see how these guys dressed, and you instinctively know they were both bachelors. It is somewhat ironic, though, that both Elijah and John the Baptist seemed to have trouble with the ladies. Hostile women wanted to kill them and to take their lives. With Elijah, it was Jezebel. Now, Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." And then with John the Baptist, it was Herodias. Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It's not lawful for you to have her." He had married his brother's wife. Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him to be a prophet. So on Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." And you wonder why these guys were lifelong bachelors. Another similarity is both Elijah and John the Baptist anointed their successors at the Jordan River. Elijah's successor was Elijah. John the Baptist's successor was Jesus. And when they anoint their successors at the Jordan River, there's a supernatural object from the sky that somehow becomes manifest. So with Elijah, this is in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 7, 50 men of the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said, "and yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise not." And as they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. I once called Greenlawn to see if they offered that service still, but they don't apparently. And then with John the Baptist in Matthew 3, verse 13, and Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" And Jesus replied, "Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." Then John consented. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water, and at that moment, the heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Now, you may have noticed this did not happen when you or I were baptized. So we can see they share a lot of common things in their lives. They were cut from the same cloth, we might say. John the Baptist is essentially an updated Elijah 2.0. Well, let's discuss for a moment the historical background when Elijah first appears on the scene as a prophet. The story of Elijah is found in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings are so named because they record and interpret the reigns of all the kings of the northern kingdom, which was Israel, and all the kings of the southern kingdom, which was Judah, with one exception, King Saul, the very first king. The book of Kings doesn't talk about him. 3 major periods of Israel's history are distinguished in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. We begin with a united monarchy, which would have been about 931 BC. During this time, Judah and Israel remained united under Solomon as they had been under Saul and under David. But then the monarchy divided. And that was when the kingdom split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. Well, the northern kingdom was later carried off into captivity by the Assyrians around 722 BC. And here you see the Assyrians have taken off all this area, except right here, this little piece of Judah, for some reason, remained independent for another 136 years. And then eventually the southern kingdom was carried off and defeated by the Babylonians. The southern kingdom lasts 136 years longer than the northern kingdom. Now, the author of 1st and 2nd Kings, we don't really know who it is. Scholarship seems to favor that it was Ezra. Some think it was Ezekiel. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings were written not only to record history, but more importantly, to teach the lessons of history. The author's chief historical concern was to preserve a record of the kings of both Israel and Judah. He traces the decline of the northern and southern kingdom, points out the reasons for that decline, and gives us the fate of each king in particular. Now, when Elijah is introduced to us, a king named Ahab is the king of the northern kingdom. So Elijah is a prophet ministering to the northern kingdom called Israel. All the kings of the northern kingdom, every single one of them were bad. The kings of the southern kingdom, there was a mixture of both good and bad kings. So that's the historical background. This is the religious background. In the 38th year of King Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to worship Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than any or all of the kings before him. Jezebel is the baddest bad girl in the Bible. Jezebel's name, her name means, where is Baal? No one names their daughter Jezebel today because of her reputation. Her father was the king of Sidon. He murdered his way to the throne by assassinating all of his competition, which were mainly his brothers. Some scholars believe the Phoenician coast is where Jezebel and her father hailed from, that it was settled by the refugees from Sodom and Gomorrah, who fled the valley of Siddim when the cities were destroyed. So some of those people got away, apparently, or this is thought to have happened, or they happened, citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah who happened to be away when the cities were destroyed, and then they resettled along the Phoenician coast. Now, Jezebel and her father, they practiced a particular form of Baal worship that was so bizarre, it was considered evil even by other Baal worshipers. This is roughly equivalent to being so weird that someone like Dennis Rodman thinks you're weird. If Dennis Rodman thinks you're weird, you might want to dial back the weirdness a bit. Well, Baal worship was weird. In fact, according to Roman historians, the Romans were completely freaked out by Baal worship when they first encountered it. Archaeology in this part of the world has led to the discovery of erotic poems describing the racy episodes of Baal and his female consorts, Anat, Astarte, and Asherah. Most of the eroticism occurs while they are knee-deep and sometimes even hip-deep in blood and gore. The poetry is awash with sexual aggression and perversion of every kind. Apparently, the Baal worship that Jezebel and her family engaged in was of this more violent and, and gory strain. So, followers of Baal tried to act out some of this poetry, believing that it would promote rain and fertility, because Baal was a storm deity who rode on the clouds. Now, Baal initially controlled the weather, he controlled fertility, but like all gods of the past, sooner or later he lost his mojo, and soon he could only control things like when people got out of Baal. How the mighty have fallen. Nonetheless, when he had his mojo, the crop cycle was tied to Baal. Every year, Baal was defeated by the god Mot, who was the god of death, at which time he died, Baal would die, and the land would become unproductive because he was the god of fertility, and Baal would be sent to the netherworld. And then in a later battle, with his babe Anat at his side, Baal would return victorious from the netherworld, and the rains returned. The author of Kings declares Ahab had gone further into idolatry than Jeroboam, who was the first king to introduce idolatry to the northern kingdom. Jeroboam made idols in a feeble attempt to worship Yahweh in an alternative way. That's why he built a temple in Samaria. So the reason he did that was so the people would not be tempted to go down to Judah to where the other temple was. So Jeroboam was attempting to worship the right God in the wrong way. Ahab took it a step further, and he just said, let's ignore Yahweh altogether. Let's just worship Baal. All right, so that's the background. Let's take a look at it now. Ahab meets Elijah. 1 Kings 17, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Elijah comes out of nowhere. This is the first time we even hear of this guy. Elijah lived in Gilead, east of the Jordan River, in a community known as Tishbe. This town is so insignificant to world history that to this day, we're not exactly sure where Tishbe is located. Furthermore, the Hebrew word used here stating that Elijah was from Tishbe literally means of the settlers. So Elijah was from the settlers in Gilead, suggesting he might have been an immigrant, maybe even a non-Jew. God's grandest heroes are often not the ones that would be obvious to us. God often chooses people from the place of obscurity. And Elijah was prepared by the Lord to demonstrate to all Israel that Yahweh, not Baal, is the only true and living God. Even Elijah's name conveys this conviction. The first part of his name, El, stands for Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God or gods. I stands for my, so that's my God, and Yah is Yahweh, so his name means my God is Yahweh. Armed with his faith in God, Elijah walked in to Samaria, into the palace. He hurled this pronouncement at King Ahab, only at my word will there be dew or rain. Note here, he's only described as Elijah the Tishbite. He's not even called Elijah the prophet or Elijah the man of God here. So we can reasonably conclude this was probably the first time he ever revealed himself to be a prophet of God. In any event, his proclamation struck at the very heart of Baalism, because God was supposed to control, or Baal was supposed to control the dew and the rain. So this drought brought on by the true God showed that the God of Israel, not Baal, controls the weather and is therefore the true God. This was a remarkable demonstration of God's superiority over Baal and the total inadequacy and falsehood of Baal worship. Interestingly, as quickly as Elijah appears, he also disappears. Verse 2, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. So having made this dramatic announcement, Elijah is then told by the Lord to leave, to flee the area. Elijah was not told why he should hide, but it's not really hard to figure out. Once Ahab figured out that Elijah was telling the truth, that there would be no rain except at his word, undoubtedly Ahab would have sent out forces to look for Elijah, to bring him back and make him give that word. And this must have been very frustrating for Ahab. Some apparent nut job waltzes into your palace, makes some crazy pronouncement that ends up not being so crazy, and now you have no idea where he is or when he will come back. The Lord further told Elijah, you will drink from the brook. I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. The exact location of the seasonal brook is unknown, but it was one of the many brooks that flowed during the rainy season, only to later dry up when the weather turned hot. God promised to provide food and drink for his prophet from this very unlikely spot. So he did what God had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. Now, if I had been Elijah, I would have had a ton of questions when the Lord told me all this. Like, okay, Lord, how long am I going to be at the Kerith ravine exactly? How much food are the ravens going to bring me? How often are they going to bring me the food? Is it going to be at the same time every day? What am I supposed to do? Elijah doesn't ask any of this. He just trusts the Lord. Verse 6, the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. The Hebrew word for bread just means food in general. It doesn't have to be bread. So this could mean that the ravens brought him berries, fruits, nuts, eggs, things like that. The reason that the Lord used ravens, as I understand, they can fly quite a distance, and the food probably had to be brought from a distance because of the drought, and they probably didn't have things nearby. Now, in doing this, God is actually doing more than simply feeding his prophet. He is also nourishing Elijah's faith to prepare him for the things yet to come. But then Elijah's brook dries up. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. How long Elijah stayed at the brook is not revealed. Sometime later, it dried up because of the drought. Ironically, the man of God who announced this drought and said at his word there would be neither rain nor dew is affected himself by the drought he announced. He is not immune from the drought. So what is he supposed to do now? The brook is dried up. We will continue in that narrative next time. For now, I want us to consider just some applications from what we've read in these first 6 verses. Now, throughout the Bible, we find that God likes to choose somebody who is really a nobody, so he can show the world how he can change that nobody into a somebody. Most of the time, God chooses someone that we would never, ever pick to do that thing. And Elijah is a great example of this principle. If I were picking someone to go before a king, I think I would pick someone a bit more polished in their appearance than this wild man in a garment of hair. Imagine Elijah coming into the palace looking like Cousin It from the Addams Family. Talk about someone who's creepy and kooky, not to mention ooky. Anyway, I heard someone say a long time ago, though, you will never understand the choices of God by looking at the ones chosen. And this is certainly true with Elijah. God always seems to go on the road less traveled. He always has a sense of humor with all of his picks. Consider this. In the New Testament, the Lord said, let me see, for my champion of grace, who would be a good pick for that? I think I'll go with this murdering, legalistic Pharisee named Saul of Tarsus. That ought to confuse the heck out of everybody. Now, who to get for my champion of hope and assurance? Well, I think I'll go with this fishy wobbler named Simon Bar-Jonah, whose emotions just kind of splatter all over the place. And then just to make it extra ironic, let's change his name to Peter, meaning rock. And finally, for my champion of love, how about this kid who asked my son to burn down entire villages and kill everybody in the village just because they were a little inhospitable? And just for giggles, let's call that hothead John the Beloved. I'm afraid I have bad news for every single person in this room. Chances are good you are dumb enough and weak enough and stubborn enough to be greatly used by God. Because God likes to take nobodies and turn them into somebodies. It's just a chance we all take. Instead of using someone polished and erudite to confront the king, God uses this wild man, Elijah. All right, let's talk about spiritual drought. Now, before that brook went completely dry, every day Elijah had to go out that brook, and I'm sure that he noticed that it was diminishing a little bit more every day. And I wonder what he thought about, what he was observing. As the water began to dry up, did his anxiety begin to increase? Did his hope and assurance in the Lord dry up a little bit along with the brook? Because every day he went out there and he noticed a little less water was flowing until the day it was dry. This is a slow trial for Elijah. It's been said that the slow trials of life are probably the most difficult. Again, I wonder what he thought about during this period of time. Drought has been called the creeping disaster. Just think about the drought that we're experiencing right now. Lake Mead is the largest water reservoir in the United States. Here's how much it has dried up. This is how much the water level has dropped at Lake Mead. Here's what it was in 2011. Here's what it was in 2014. What happens when you don't get rain? What happens is the waters will continue to recede until they're gone. And we watch this and we feel powerless because we cannot make it rain. So every year we get a little drier. I say that drought is just a naturally occurring phenomenon due to the ebb and flow of life here on the earth. There are rainy seasons and there are stormy, wet years, and there are dry seasons and parched, arid years. But did you know this can happen spiritually to you as well? You will go through spiritual droughts as a Christian. You're going to go through dry seasons in life. You might be in one right now. There are going to be times in your Christian journey when you feel like you are emotionally or spiritually drying up. All Christians experience this. There are droughts where, for whatever reasons, our souls begin to feel parched. Our marriage has grown stale. Our relationship with our children has become strained. Our friends do not seem to understand us. There are spiritual droughts when we find the joy of our salvation has withered away, that our love has grown cold, that our hope feels like it is unmoored, that our faith has become listless. I would imagine some of you here today are experiencing this as I speak. some brook in your life is drying up. Maybe your brook was a job that you love, but recently you were told you might lose your job. Your brook is drying up. Or maybe you received bad news from your doctor. There was a problem with your blood work. There's a concern with your x-ray or scan. Your brook is drying up. Or maybe someone you love recently told you they don't love you anymore. And your brook is drying up. An engagement was called off. Maybe a divorce is pending. Or maybe you were involved in a ministry that brought you great joy and a great sense of fulfillment. Or you belong to a church that you loved, but then something unexpected happened, and you are no longer at that church, you are no longer involved in that ministry that you loved. Your brook was drying up. So what does it mean when your brook dries up? I think when your brook dries up in one area, all it really means is that God is now going to provide for you in a different way. And you have to trust the Lord to meet your needs now through another source. It may be far different from how your needs were met before. But God will not fail you. Now, I, for one, do not like change. I want God to meet my same old needs in the same old ways that He always has until I decide they might need to change. I don't like it when He decides they need to change. You know, if I want to go check out some other brook before my brook's entirely dried up, then that's my business, but I don't want God drying up my current brook unless I'm good and ready for it. Now, here's the irony to Elijah's situation. We know for a fact that the dried up brook was an answer to Elijah's own prayer. He had prayed, stated there would be neither dew nor rain in the region. And now he is experiencing the consequence of having said that. Do you ever notice that sometimes we offer prayers, but we don't want to face the consequences of our prayers? We pray things like, Lord, make me a godly person, but don't let me suffer. Well, what if suffering is the only way to make you godly? Lord, teach me to be patient and gracious, but don't invade my comfort zone. Well, how exactly are you going to learn to be patient and gracious if you're comfortable and content? Lord, strengthen my faith, but don't remove any of my blessings. For faith to grow, it must encounter obstacles and challenges. Here's where I think we're really going to struggle with this. What do we want right now? We want a revival in our nation. Pray for revival of our nation. But would we really want it? If the Lord decided in order for that revival to happen, we had to go through some terrible drought or pandemic, which would affect us as well. Do we really want it? Be careful what you pray for, because the Lord will answer your prayer in His way, not yours. And sometimes, if you've been a Christian for very long, you know that the Lord answers your prayer in a way you do not want and you did not expect. It's easy for us to trust the Lord when all of our brooks are running along, seem to have adequate water. But now that it's drying up, what will you do? Why does God allow our brooks to dry up? Why does this even happen? I think he lets it happen so that we learn to depend upon him and not the brook. Ever consider the possibility that the sound of your little babbling brook that you love might actually be drowning out his voice? But in the stillness of a dried up brook, you hear him. You listen for him. I think God allows our brook to dry up so that we will not become dependent upon the brook and thereby forget the God of the brook. It is God who sustains us, not the brook. And so sometimes God decides in his infinite wisdom to allow a brook of ours to dry up, not because he has forgotten us, because for some reason at that moment we have become the object of his special attention. Only God's grace can sustain you when you are experiencing the drought of the desert and your brook is drying up. You see, it is in those desert times of life that God gets something he may rarely only get when you are experiencing the blessings of whatever your brook is. He gets your full, undivided attention. Because when your brook is drying up, you have to trust God one moment at a time. And the question is, are you willing to do that? All you have is this moment. Do you trust him enough to trust him with it when your brook is drying up?